Yes, hello everyone. You're welcome to our second lecture. I hope and pray that we are all doing well. In our first topic, which was the previous lecture we had, we introduced macroeconomics and we discussed that macroeconomics, as micro looks at individual firms, macroeconomics looks at the entire economy. We gave an example of microeconomics looking at a tree, and macroeconomics looks at the entire forest of factors that may affect or influence the entire forest. So among the national or economical issues or macroeconomic issues, we have economic growth or measurement of national economy. In other words, we are always interested in knowing whether our economy is economically growing, is it a standstill or retarding, or what we call a recess. So in today's class, we are going to look at how national economy is measured. So several methods are used to track economic growth, but the most commonly known is the gross domestic product, abbreviated as GDP. Though in some instances we use what we call the gross national product, or GNP. So gross domestic product basically measures the value of all goods and services produced by a nation. So if we talk about a nation, remember in a country or a nation, we might have foreigners and nationals. So for national gross product, we look at the value of goods and services produced within boundaries of a particular country, regardless of whether those products are produced by nationals or foreigners. But as long as those foreigners are within the country, their products are also included as we are calculating the gross domestic product. On the other hand, gross national product measures the value of goods and services produced by a country and also adds on income from foreign investments. So an economy might have investments, or we could even have nationals with investments out of the country. So when we use the gross national product approach or method of tracking economic growth, here we also are in addition to what is produced within the country, we add on what the country earns from abroad. And so we are going to look at one at a time. We are going to first look at the most commonly used, which is the gross domestic product, which is the total monetary or market value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders within a specified period of time. Here, period of time, we basically use a year, or it is calculated annually, but in some instances we could also do quarters, so that is after every 3 months. So because gross domestic product provides a broad measurement of a country's production, it is always thought of as being a scorecard or a yardstick for a country's economic health. We have different types of gross domestic product. The first is nominal gross domestic product, which is the simplest representation of GDP. And here we basically use raw data without any adjustments. So nominal GDP is an assessment of economic production in an economy, and this includes current prices within its calculation. So for nominal GDP, we usually don't cater for inflation, or in case there are any rises in prices that could inflate the economic growth figure. So on the other hand, we have what we call the real GDP, which actually takes into account inflation. So here we usually base our calculations in comparison to production over a period of time. So we usually base, or we have a base year and then compare that GDP with the current year. The other type is the GDP per capita, or gross domestic product per capita, which usually basically looks at the GDP per person. All here we are interested in what every individual in the country generally earns, which affects the standard of living. So the GDP per capita can indicate the average productivity or average living standard of individuals. The other type is the GDP growth rate, which is the increase or decrease in GDP from year to year. So here we compare over year or quarterly change in the country's output to measure whether the economy is actually growing or not, or if it is growing, is the growth gradual or significant. So this is usually expressed as a percentage, and this measure is popular for economic policymakers because it is thought to be closely connected to key policy targets such as inflation and unemployment rates. So the calculation of a country's GDP encompasses all private and public consumption, government outlays or government expenditure, investments, and then additions to private inventories, paid in construction costs, and foreign balance of trade. So here, the balance of trade, we basically look at the difference between exports and imports. So every time a country's imports, these are products or services that a country buys or brings in from other countries, while exports are what we sell out of the country to other countries. So whenever we sell out, we are earning, and every time we spend on something that comes in the country, that is an outflow. So meaning when the exports are greater than imports, it means we are earning more than we spend. So that is a good condition. But if it is the other way around, then the country is spending more, which might put us into a deficit. So all the components that make up a country's GDP are very important. This is what I've been talking about, that when our exports are greater than imports, we have what we call a trade surplus. And when the imports are greater than exports, then we have a trade deficit. And therefore, our GDP tends to decrease with such a situation. So how do we calculate GDP? So there are three basic methods for calculation of the gross domestic product. The first is the expenditure approach. We have the output or production approach, and then the income approach. We are going to look at one at a go, and we are starting with the expenditure approach. So under this approach, we basically look at spending by different groups that participate in an economy. Here we talk about the private individuals or consumers like me and you. We talk about government spending. We talk about investments, and then the net exports. So in this case, net exports are the difference between exports and imports. So every time we are calculating GDP using the expenditure approach, we look at what we spend on consumption, add government expenditure. So government expenditure can be expenditure on roads, on schools. It could be during a recession, for example, during the COVID-19 situation, the government came in to spend more on food. So where the consumption was, or individual spending on consumption was low, the government came in to cover up. So that is very key. So and we also add investments, what businesses buy for their expansion, and then the net exports. So the sum of this all gives us the gross domestic product. And please note that for these three approaches, the expenditure approach, the production out approach, and the income approach, when calculated accurately, they should all give the same answer. So these are just different methods, but they should arrive to the same growth rate. So all these activities contribute to the GDP of a country. The activities I've mentioned are consumption, expenditure, government expenditure, investment, and then the net exports. So this slide basically entails what I've talked about. It is just an explanation of the formula. And we have an example here where we are required to calculate the GDP. We have consumer spending as $200 million, investment spending $55 million, and then state and local government spending at $120 million, federal government spending at $80 million, imports were $50 million, exports were $45 million, and income taxes were $100 million. So you remember our formula to get GDP, we add consumer spending plus government expenditure plus investment, and then plus the net exports. And please note that net exports are the difference between exports and imports. So we start by summarizing. So consumer spending, how many do we have? I think it is reflected once, so that is $200. And then the government spending, we have the state and local government spending, but also we have the federal government spending. So we add these two. So that is 120 plus 80 to give us the 200 that we see here. And then we have investment. Investment spending was $55 million, which is here. And then we have our NX, which is the net export. So that is the difference between exports and imports. Our exports are 45 and the imports are 50. So we have a negative, meaning we have a trade deficit. We imported, or we spent more than what we earned from our exports, which is not a very good situation. So therefore, calculating our GDP, that will give us the 200, which is for consumer spending, plus government spending, which is also 200, plus the investment, which is 55, and then plus the net export, which is a negative 5, giving us 450 millions. And there we are for the expenditure approach. The other approach for calculating GDP is the production approach. So here, this is essentially the reverse of the expenditure approach. So as the expenditure approach measures costs or what we spend, here we estimate the economic value of what we produce. So for the other expenditure approach, we are looking at costs. In other words, we are looking at what we spend or what we pay to acquire either service or product. But here, But for the production approach, we look at the economic value of the output. So in other words, when you're calculating for GDP, we sum up all the monetary value of all products. So that is products by private individuals, by government, and by nationals or foreigners, but within the boundaries of the country. So then the other approach is the income approach, which represents a kind of middle ground between the expenditure and production approaches when calculating GDP. So here we look at the income earned by all factors of production in an economy. So we look at wages or salaries to labor, we look at rent, we look at the return on capital, and in the form of interest and corporate profits. So when we are adding GDP, we add all the payments to factors of production in an economy. So this would be the formula. So we look at total national income, which is the sum of all wages, rent, interest, and net profit margin. So the net profit margin, we know how to get it. So it is that ratio used to calculate the percentage profit, and the profit is got by subtracting the selling prices, cost of production from selling prices. So the net profit margin would be the percentage or the ratio. Then on top of that, we add the sales taxes, we add depreciation, which is the cost to a tangible asset over its useful life. And then we also add in the net foreign factor income. So the net foreign factor income is the difference between the total income that a country's citizens and companies generate in foreign countries. For example, we have our girls and boys working in Arab countries, in Dubai. So what they earn versus the total income foreign citizens and companies generate within our countries. So the income Ugandans earn from abroad versus the income that the foreigners we have in the country generate within the country. So the difference between the two gives the net foreign factor income. So meaning we have a surplus if what our nationals earn from abroad is more than what the foreigners generate within our country. So that is the net factor income. So this gives an insight about the difference among the three. We have gross domestic product, we have gross national product, and gross national income. So I've discussed that gross domestic product measures the economic activity within physical borders of a country. So this is regardless of whether the products are produced by nationals or foreigners, but as long as they are within the borders of a country, all that is produced is GDP, or is considered when calculating GDP. So while gross national product is the measure of overall production of people or corporations native to a country, including those based abroad. So when we are measuring economic growth using gross national product, we only concentrate on products produced by nationals within the borders of the country. Here we exclude what is produced by foreigners. So, for example, if we have Chinese companies or factories within the country, when we are calculating economic growth using the gross national product approach, we don't include what is produced by such companies. However, we add what our nationals that are abroad produce or earn. So for gross domestic product, we concentrate on what produced within the country, regardless of whether it is produced by nationals or foreigners, but within boundaries, specific boundaries of an economy. Gross national product, we only concentrate on what is produced by the domestic nationals or by the nationals of the country, and then we also add what is produced by our nationals that are out of the country. So that is the difference between gross domestic product and gross national product. So the other measure of economic growth is the gross national income, which is the sum of the country's gross domestic product plus the net income from abroad. So for national product, we add the production or what products produced by our nationals but out of the country. But for gross national income, in addition to the gross domestic product, we add on what our nationals from abroad earn, probably from employment. So this represents the value produced by a country's economy in a given year, regardless of whether the source of the value created is domestic or receipts from overseas. So thank you so much. This is all I had for us. Stay well.